Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming today. I didn't know how many we have here this morning, so I'm excited. I'm glad I'm ready. Anyway, let's pray and we'll get going. Heavenly Father, I do thank you for this day. I thank you for this time. Sunday school, I pray you just bless the teaching and the preaching of thy word. I pray that we get some wisdom today. And I pray you just be with all the classes and the services. I pray your hand upon us. Guide us and strengthen us, Lord, for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, the title of the lesson is reducing debt. We talked a little bit, of course, the first class we talked about, of course, making sure our hearts are right about trying to get our finances in order and making money. And we talked about setting up a budget last time, and we talked a little bit about reducing debts, and I'm going to talk a little more in depth on it today. But I wanted to circle back. If you flip the 2 pages over, there's a little diagram on the back of this. And one thing that we didn't touch on too much as far as budgeting, I just wanted to highlight kind of this principle for us to think about and for you to think about. And of course, this isn't my idea. This is taken from a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which is kind of an interesting read. Again, I think I've said before, I don't agree with everything he says, but he has some interesting concepts. And this is one of them. This is one of his interesting concepts that I think is worth kind of thinking about. And the concept is this. So the first diagram, so we're on the back page of that handout for Susan and Ariel. That the first column there in the diagram, the quote poor, right? This isn't my language, it's his language in the book. He said this is how poor, quote, poor people manage their money. You get a job, and that's your income, which is a salary, whatever. And then you use that to pay your expenses, and that's where it goes out. Okay, I mean, it makes basic sense, right? That's kind of how we operate. And then as time goes on, you might move into the middle class. And what does the middle class typically do? The middle class takes on liabilities, cars, houses, credit card debt, because you start earning more in income from that job, it becomes salary. Now your expenses sort of pass through these liabilities that you take on in life. And a lot of people think of a house as an asset, which in some sense it is. This particular guy here, he does not agree that a house is an asset, because he defines an asset as something that makes you money, and your house typically does not make you money. Now it might someday at the end, but not kind of on a daily or weekly basis. I was thinking about the first house that Jen and I ever bought in Cleveland. I think we paid maybe $70,000 or $75,000 for that house, somewhere around there. And we lived there 7 years, 8 years, something like that. And we did sell it for $95,000, I think, or around there. So, we kind of made money, but, how much work did we put into it over that time? We redid floors, and we updated bathrooms, and we did stuff to the kitchen, and, we probably made like $1 an hour or something, and, in work and effort. So, we kind of made out. It's cheap living, right? Ultimately, it's cheap living and paid for itself, but it's not like you don't always make a ton of money on a house. So he considers it a liability, and I think rightly so. And then, cars are a liability. They don't make you money. They decrease in value. Credit card debt's the same way. School loans, same way. There's maybe value to those things, but ultimately they just cost you. So the rich look at it different. Notice that they've removed the job from this, okay? And the thinking, and I'm generalizing greatly here, right? But the thinking is not to make money from the quote job, but to make money from assets, things that add value, that bring you in money, things like real estate, stocks, bonds, intellectual property. That's what the rich do, and that's how they focus. Okay, so I think it's a good way to distinguish between the thinking along the way, and I'm not suggesting that anyone is necessarily bad. It's just to illustrate how the thinking can be different. And so one way to increase our financial position is to think more about the assets, and are there things we can do, usually slowly over time for most of us, to increase our assets. Most of the budgets that we talked about when we were talking about budgets were basically those expenses that people were thinking of. And we weren't thinking of using a portion of our money to add assets, okay, to us. Okay. And it's pretty easy today to think about adding assets, just the way, with online access. I mean, you can buy a stock from an app on your phone, and you can spend as little as $5, sometimes even less with some of the apps to buy. So you want to own a little bit of Apple, right? You can spend $5 and you can own a little piece of Apple. You do that every week, every time you get a paycheck. Over time, it accumulates into assets, things that can make you money. We'll talk about all of that in different classes. And of course, there's risks and there's benefits, and we got to always keep the Christian perspective in mind as we think about those things. So now let's flip the page back, and talk about debt a little bit. Okay, should a Christian use credit? Well, the Bible has a lot to say about credit. In fact, the debit and credit system was an active part of the Israel community. Okay, it's talked about quite a few times in ancient Israel. In the Old Testament, debt was at times necessary for people to survive. It was a ministry to the poor that people had. As a result, God established a structure for the lending system at that time. And there were some basic rules. One was you couldn't charge interest. Okay, and this was generally within the Jewish community. Okay, within the Israelites, not the Amorites and the Canaanites and all that kind of stuff, right? So you couldn't charge interest. You couldn't remove items necessary for one's livelihood. Okay, so if somebody owed you money, you couldn't go over and confiscate things that they needed to survive. That wasn't the approach that God allowed. Today we have repossession, for example. You couldn't go in and repossess somebody's furniture or their tools or things like that. And then every 7 years they had this forgiveness of debt. And I mean, today we look at that, but that'd be awesome, yeah. Right? To get your debt forgiven every 7 years. Of course, I think probably they were very thoughtful about when they got into that debt, right? Looking at the situation. It was more of a ministry to help the poor, because you know that you were going to forgive that. At least under God's requirements, you were going to forgive that every 7 years. So God had this structure in place. Today, it's not this way, right? Today, debt is basically a function of convenience and a hindrance to the impatient, right? We're not patient for things, so we go into debt to acquire them. Those who accumulate more items use debt to continue to accumulate more things, and this could be credit card debt, it could be car loans, it could even be house loans as well. So that's how we use it today. Now, no doubt there's some people today that are having to use debt to get by, right? To survive. Loss of jobs, things like that are happening today as well. But generally, that's, at least in America, We just think about it to acquire things. So there's a lot of concerns with debt from a biblical perspective. One is that it creates a situation of servitude and obligation to creditors, of course. So Proverbs 22:7 is the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. And we touched on this a little bit, right? When you borrow money, you become a servant to that. You have an obligation to pay it back. Debts are commitments, they're promises that a person makes, that a Christian makes. Okay, so you're essentially making a promise to repay that. One of the challenges is that those debts tie us down, okay, and they dictate our future. Okay, you make decisions. You take on a mortgage. You're committing to living in that location, right, in that community for a period of time, and that may be okay. And we understand that God can work things out, and if He wants you somewhere, right, He'll figure out a way for you to move. Jen and I experienced that. When we moved to Indiana, we lived in Delphi, and bought a kind of a neat old house in downtown Delphi, and it's a long story, and I won't go into all the details, but God was working on us and wanting us to get grounded and faithful in a church, and we weren't going to do it there out in Delphi. It just, for us, it wasn't going to happen for a variety of reasons. And so just, at some point, I think God was speaking to both of us and said, you need to move. You need to put this house for sale and move into Lafayette and start coming faithfully here. And so we put it up for sale, and it was a beautiful house. So within a few days we had people looking at it, and we had one couple in particular that were really interested. They spent how many hours in the house. They came on a Sunday morning while we were at church, and my sister was visiting with us, and we got pulled up after church, and they were still there, and it had been over 2 hours that they were looking like, okay, you guys get out of here, I'm hungry, I want lunch, all those things. But 4 months went by, and nothing happened, and we were just like, I don't know what's gonna work here, it just doesn't seem like. And then just all of a sudden we had a good realtor. We had a lowball offer from somebody, which we would have lost quite a bit of money. And our realtor took that, called this couple that spent so much time, called their realtor and said, I don't know if you guys are still interested, but we do have an offer on the place, so just let me know. So within 24 hours, we had our asking price plus $1. And it was just, God He just lined it up for us. And we were excited, of course, and we were praising Him for letting us kind of get out of that situation and be able to move, and so God can move things around, of course, but these debts do tie us down, and people will get into so much debt that any hope they have for the future starts to get destroyed. Right, because the debt is all consuming. Okay, that's all you think about. That's all you go to work to do. You wait for the paycheck so you can pay those bills, and you sell away your future. Why? Because you're discontented with the present. Right? You want to buy things. You want things, so you generate that debt because there's something not right there in the present. Okay, and you lose the freedom. You lose the freedom to follow God's direction. Pastor has told a story before. He was looking for help for the girls' home at the time. He was looking for a maintenance guy, and of course he calls pastors around, and there was a gentleman interested out of a good church, and he felt that it was a great opportunity for him. It was maybe what God wanted him to do. He had all the skills. He was interested in moving to Mississippi, he and his wife. And then they started talking about salary, and the salary wasn't what he thought he needed. And pastor's like, well, what do you think you need? Well, he said, I need this, this, and this because I have this debt. Credit card bills, car payments. And ultimately he didn't do it because he couldn't take the pay. He wouldn't move. So it's a hindrance, okay? Nevertheless, debt is not necessarily sin. It may be, at times it probably is, but not necessarily always. Debt is a system that God had offered direction and structure for the Israel community. But the Bible scarcely mentions debt in a positive light. It's just really not mentioned in a positive light. Proverbs, I read that 22:7, the rich ruleth over the poor and the borrower is servant to the lender, not positive light. Psalm 37:21, the wicked borroweth and payeth not again, but the righteous showeth mercy and giveth. Okay, Romans, can't remember what that is, Romans 13 is, read that real quick. 6-8, for this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers and attending continually upon this very thing, right? So this is talking about, essentially paying your taxes, okay? Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear is due, honor to whom honor. Verse 8, owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Yeah, when you owe people things, it's hard to treat them always the same way, right? Because there's this thing between you, right? There's this obligation. And it happens with Christian brothers and sisters too. Things like you borrow a tool or something, guys, and if you hang on to it a little too long, it becomes this thing between you, right? So the key is to borrow it, use it, and return it, because that's what you owe back, and try to do that quickly and efficiently so it doesn't build up between the two of you. And a book called Debt-Free Living. And let me clarify. It's probably not always clear that most of what we're talking about here is personal finances. When you start thinking about business finances, there's probably some changes in the way we think, and I'll touch on that as we go through some of these principles. And we can think a little bit differently about it, because of things like taxes and being able to deduct expenses from a business and things like that. But so here's a principle. The first one, debt is not normal for God's children. It's not a normal state of living for Christians. God would prefer us not to be in debt to others, okay, as a normal state. Don't accumulate long-term debt. Debt should be a temporary. At best, it should be a temporary event. It should not be a way of life. Avoid surety. Now, we haven't talked too much about this, right? But surety is agreeing to pay a debt for someone else if they default. And the Bible doesn't speak about this. The Bible speaks about this in a negative light also. Primarily, it uses the word strangers, right? And so I think it's mostly meant to be non-family type people, right? Is where it speaks the most to in those verses in Proverbs. And so, but again, it's not spoken of in a light. So, right, this would be like cosigning for a loan, right? And oftentimes parents will do this for kids, and sometimes there's probably other situations. I wouldn't necessarily be against parents doing it for kids, because I don't think the Bible speaks to that. The Bible talks about strangers, about friends, and not doing it there. But there's a responsibility that is put on both people in that situation, right? The borrower has the responsibility to pay, because they could undermine both themselves and the one who is co-signing for them right? And so you can create a dangerous situation that can separate people, right? And it ought not to separate people. So anybody that would find themselves in that situation, pay off the debt as soon as possible. Or if some time goes by and you can refinance and get that other person's name off of there, do that to separate the situation, okay? And don't do it I think children do it prayerfully. Anybody else, avoid it. Bible basically says avoid it, okay? And then, of course, we know that the borrower has an absolute commitment to repay. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. And of course, this is about a vow to God, but a Christian's promise is a promise. Their yea is yea and their nay is nay. And so you better figure out how to pay that. Pay with that which thou hast vowed. Better it is that thou shouldst not vow than that thou shouldst vow and not pay. And then this other book here, Taming the Money Monster, this author suggests 4 things to think about before borrowing money. And I guess this is where I was really thinking about the kind of the business side of things. Rule number 1 is kind of this common sense rule. The economic return must be greater than the economic cost. To state it another way, when money is borrowed, the thing that was borrowed to purchase should either grow in value or pay an economic return greater than the cost of borrowing. Okay, so for your personal finances, what can you look at to purchase that you would have to borrow, to purchase that would increase in value? Well, there's not a lot of things I can think of that I would go into debt for that would actually increase in value. If I had some sort of insight, people do this in the stock market, right? You can borrow money to buy stocks, and then, hopefully they go up, and then you can sell them and make money, but people lose their shirts doing stuff like that, right? It's very risky. So there's not a lot of things that I could think of. Now on a business side of things, it's a little bit different. Okay, so suppose you need a piece of equipment because you have jobs lined up where you need that piece of equipment to complete the job efficiently. Okay, so you borrow money to buy the piece of equipment, and then you're going to use that, right, to make money, and it's going to pay for itself. So there's an economic value toward, as long as you can charge enough to cover the cost of that equipment, then that might be a good pathway to go down. Okay. So in other words, don't go and borrow a bunch of money for something that is sure to go down in value. This rules out credit cards. It rules out card debt too. And I know we do it all the time, right? Hopefully we can get away from the credit cards. A lot of people have car payments, okay? And we're gonna probably next week, Lord willing, we're gonna do some math, and we're gonna look at some of these things and see why it's not always the best pathway. And then rule number 2, you have to have a guaranteed way to repay. You have a way to pay off the debt. We know that life doesn't always go as planned. Is the loan that you're looking at one that could sink you? Is the worst case scenario one that you could recover from, right? Job losses, things like that definitely happen. We see that happening all over the country right now. You can go online and read stories, sometimes very sad stories, about people who essentially, they've lost jobs and they're losing everything because they've got mortgage payments, they've got car payments, now they've lost their job, they can't get a job, and they're suffering greatly because of it. And of course, integrity is an issue here for the Christian. Let your yea be yea, which we talked about already. Your income should be conservatively adequate to make the payment. This is where bankers will deceive you, lenders will deceive you. The standard thinking that's out there, I think, is deceptive. And you just have to be really careful. Here's an example of the standard thinking. Don't let your mortgage payment be more than 25% of your take-home pay, right? I mean, that's what bankers will look to, and some may even look at and say, oh, well, maybe 30% is okay for this person. Okay. You have to look at that and say, is that really comfortable for me and the way we live? Is that really a pathway to financial freedom here? Is to take on that much debt, so 25% of your income is going out to a mortgage payment. Okay. So it's that kind of thing. Would you be better off with 20% or 15%? Yes, that usually results in a smaller house. It may not be exactly what you want, but there can be great peace of mind knowing that that payment is less. Right? So that number 3 there, just as an example, if you borrow $150,000 for a house that's worth $250,000, then you'll be able to repay easily by selling the house in those cases. But if you borrow $250,000 for a $250,000 house, which some lenders will still do today, then if the market takes a downturn and for some reason you need to sell, you're stuck. You're in trouble. You're going to take on a big loss. So there's a comfort level there that you should have in considering these decisions. And it's that peace of heart and mind. Sometimes the calculator needs to be the last thing, not the first one, right? The rule suggests that you should only borrow money where there's so much margin that it cannot challenge your financial peace, but it still may not be a peaceful decision, so you have to pray about it, right? For the kingdom of God is not meat and drink, it's not these things, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Ghost. So if these things are unsettling, don't do it. And then this rule number 4 I like, right? It's unity. Right? In marriage, couples should not borrow money unless they both agree that it is a, quote, good choice. Okay? What if every couple applied that line of thinking to every decision, right? What could we possibly want so badly that we're willing to jeopardize relationship with our spouse, right? It just should not happen at all. So husbands and wives need to be on the same page with this type of stuff as well as anything else. Okay. And then, if debt is a problem for you, generally the Christian wisdom would get out of it as soon as possible. Work hard to reduce it. I've heard Dave Ramsey say things like, if you're in debt, the only time you should see the inside of a restaurant is if you're working there. Right? And I think it makes a lot of sense. Right?
All right. I say ouch.
Ouch, yes. I like a lot of things he says, but he's kind of harsh on some things, on some people.
You'll get out of debt faster.
Exactly.
But I need my Big Mac. You don't understand.
Yeah.
Wait. Yeah. You don't have to go inside to get the Big Mac.
Exactly.
There you go.
Up your game, Ramsey.
Now you see the bag full of food
Should be
from the restaurant unless you're handing it out the window.
And like 5 months ago, no one saw the inside of a restaurant. So.
Well, yeah, that's true. Yeah. I've also heard him say things like, it's beans and rice living for you for the next 2 years. This is what you need to do. Beans and rice, that's what you're eating. Of course, he doesn't mean that literally, but he means no steak, no eating out. It's beans and rice for you until you get that figured out and paid off. We don't want to sacrifice like that, right? Our flesh says, I don't want to do that. And I know that's why he's hard on people when he says things like that, because he wants them, and we need to see that 2 years down the road, where do we want to be, right? And what do we want to be doing? And are we making decisions today that put us in a better position 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, right? And that's why he's pushing those types of things. And it makes sense. Of course, every person, every family has to look at this and figure out what's the best pathway for them to move ahead. So, ways to handle debt: organize your finances along biblical principles, which we talked about. Set up a budget. Tithing is part of your budget. Okay. Figure out ways to reduce debt. Okay. If you're past that, figure out ways to invest your money so that it grows for the future, for emergencies. I mean, we've covered all this in the last 2 lessons. Go back, and the videos are online. You can watch me ramble on about those things, and I got the handouts, right? Then figure out how to decrease our expenses, right? That's another area where there's a lot of value. How much are you paying for your cell phone, right? How much are you paying for this and that, car loans, internet access, whatever the case may be. Big Macs. What are you paying for your Big Macs,
Some
right?
McDonald's have mini ones.
Okay, and of course the budgeting exercise is right. I mean, it's not meant to eliminate all of those things, right? We need to have some fun, but to have it be controlled and structured, and we know where our money's going, and all of those things. We may think about downsizing, right? If your housing is too expensive, right? Should you downsize? If your vehicles are too expensive, should you downsize those things and figure out how to get out of them? I mean, it's amazing. You listen again to people call into Dave Ramsey's show. I'm amazed sometimes at the challenges that they have, where they have $900 in car payments, and they're trying to figure out how to move forward. And I mean, he's pretty frank. He's like, sell a car, sell them both, and buy a junker and get rid of it. You don't need the fancy car. You need transportation, and that's it, right? We want to avoid those kinds of decisions. We don't want to be in that place, right? So you might downsize. You might increase your income. Okay, I mean, truly, if you're thinking about building wealth, right? And again, for God's glory, right? God doesn't necessarily mind us being rich. It's a heart issue. We talked about that in the first class, right? What are you going to do with it, right? If you're building it for God's glory, you're building it for those emergencies that are going to come along in life. You want to be prepared as a Christian to deal with those things, right? If you're thinking about those things, what's your greatest tool to do that? Well, your greatest tool, really the only tool we have, is our income. That's what I got. I mean, God's allowed me to get this job. He's allowed me to get this paycheck. This is what I have. So one way is to try to increase that income, okay? And you can get second jobs to do that. You can sell stuff. I mean, we have lots of stuff, and we don't always need all the stuff. And so we can try to sell. I've been trying to sell a snowblower on Craigslist for a while. If anybody needs one, let me know. Make you a good deal. But it's too big for me to use. I don't really need it. We got a big driveway. I do have. Does somebody need one? Is that,
No, that's what you might have kids for.
Oh, yeah.
We are just a blower.
Right, yeah,
You got
exactly.
kids too.
Yeah. You're at Chloe. You get Chloe out there from now on. Shoveling.
Dad might have one of those automatic snow blowers, but we have a perfectly good shovel and
Yeah,
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So you can sell things and get rid of things and get second jobs. You can also, it's not written here, but you can expand skills, right? You can seek after new skills. And again, these are things that take time, but not necessarily looking at today, we're looking at 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. I read a story about a guy, I don't know where he was, but he was a bartender, right? He shouldn't be a bartender anyway, but he lost his job and all this stuff, right? And he couldn't live, couldn't make a living, and so he decided he'd sign up for computer coding classes online. So he started like a 16-week program where he was learning to write computer code, and pretty soon after he graduated, he got a job. 16 weeks of coding classes online, and boom, he's got a new job. Plus he's out of bartending, which is a good thing, right? So you can do things like that, right? I mean, there's so much online that can be done. And then, of course, you can negotiate with creditors. Again, this is sort of an extreme type thing. And when I did this on money a few years back, I did talk for a while about the whole bankruptcy process, and I'm not going to talk about that this time. Hopefully nobody's close to having to declare bankruptcy. But the principle being here that, you know, if you do have a lot of debt and there is not a reasonable way to pay, you can negotiate with creditors. If you're looking at a situation where you're going to default on the loan, usually you can spend some time with them. So like my stepmom went through this process. And my dad was in a nursing home for 7 years. It burned a lot of their money. She broke her hip, was living on Social Security, had too much debt. She had good equity in her house, but that's not helping sitting there when you need cash to pay the bills. And so she started negotiating with her creditors, and it took a long time, right? I mean, it was 1-2 years of, in some cases, she just didn't pay the credit card bill. And I wouldn't suggest that this is the right thing to do. Hopefully, as a Christian, you avoid getting where she got. But then she was able to get those bills cut way back, like 10% of what she owed. Because the creditors look at it, they waste time and money. They're paying people to call her and harass her. They'd rather get a little something than nothing and close it out eventually. So you can negotiate those things. Okay. And if you do, make sure you honor those commitments that you pay with or you make with people, you know, over the phone, and don't back out of that. She was a hardball negotiator too, right? It took 18 months and numerous phone calls, and the people she was talking to, well, can you just, you know, can you pay $100 a month? Can you pay $50 a month? Can you pay $20 a month? And she's like, no, but I could pay 10%. She's like, no, you know, it just went back and forth. Could you pay 50%? No, it was just, it'd be painful, right, to do that. Getting out of debt does not happen overnight, or getting into debt doesn't happen overnight, nor does getting out of debt. It takes time to do those things, and you have to be willing to sacrifice, right? You have to be willing to take on the second job. You have to be willing to sell stuff. You have to be willing to downsize. But again, looking 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, where do you want to be? Okay. Make sacrifices now for that future.
10 after.
It's 10 after, okay, go stop
11
that.
after.
But if there's any questions, or we want to debate anything or talk about anything, we'd be glad to.